Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly is what many consider to be the best in the Fatal Frame series, lauded as a pillar of the survival horror genre and of course the scariest game ever made. And while I think that last one's stretching it a bit, the praise isn't entirely unwarranted. If nothing else, it's certainly the fan favorite, and it's easy to see why. Fatal Frame 2 is where the series really came into its own, and it improves on the first game in many ways. It has real CGI as opposed to the in-game assets used in the first game's cutscenes, a friendly, if sometimes frustrating AI buddy, much better sound design, voice acting, and music, and a swanky new font to boot. Not to mention, of course, that it explores a more unique, more mature kind of horror. Fatal Frame could very easily have been a wacky one-off game where you take pictures of ghosts, but Fatal Frame 2 really goes big and firmly establishes the series' identity and its place in the horror canon. Everything there was to love about the atmosphere in the first game is present in Fatal Frame 2, from the camera's use of fixed and tracking angles to generate some intriguing and simultaneously terrifying shots, but not without a few jarring violations of the 180 rule, the unique setting, only this time rather than just a single dilapidated Japanese mansion to explore, it's an entire village, complete with caves, shrines, and even a graveyard. The good parts of the sound design in the first game are back and polished to a mirror shine in the second. Even the rumble feature mimicking a heartbeat is back, although this time it's less like a heartbeat and more like a series of small explosions, but nevertheless. The thing about Fatal Frame 2's atmosphere is the attention to detail, from candles flickering as you run past them to the frequent use of reds in the color palette. It results in an atmosphere that's enhanced by every single one of its elements. Sound design is most improved from the first game in almost every department. I appreciate that there's much less conventional music in the second game. It relies more on ambience to convey a sense of isolation and loneliness. There's often no music at all, just a low, eerie, pulsating drone and sometimes half-diegetic wind chimes. There's even a storm at one point which works absolutely wonderfully. And while there is a storm in the first game as well, this one doesn't announce itself with a jump scare. It's content to let the lightning and subsequent thunderclap introduce it, and let the distant rumbling of thunder accompany you for almost the entirety of the third chapter. It's brilliant stuff. Voice acting is also much better in the second game. There are considerably more characters this time around as well, and all of them give convincing performances, even minor ones.
The other two rings give it heart and balance its movement. It is as if it's really alive. Really alive.
They even tie the sound design to a ghost, addressing the main thing I'd like to see from the series. Curtain Shadow here doesn't make a loud heartbeat sound when he appears like most of the other ghosts, just footsteps, and it's perfect. As far as the setting is concerned, I appreciate that Fatal Frame 2 encourages and rewards exploration more so than in the first game where you just go grab the shinies. To be fair, there are hidden items in the first game, but there's only a handful of them. Here though, most of the items that aren't journals or stones are hidden away in cabinets, drawers, chests, tombstones, everything. It gives you a reason to slow down and really take in the atmosphere, which is further enhanced by some much more subtle atmospheric scares as well, which is one of my favorite new additions in Fatal Frame 2. For example, in the storehouse, one of the camera angles upon leaving shows a staircase on your right. You head upward because you know at this point that the game rewards exploration. However, you're stopped after a few steps, and with the new camera angle we can see that there's still space above Mio's head. So what do? We pull out the camera to go first person, of course, whereupon this happens. In the context of the game, this is a very mild spook. There's no fanfare and many players won't ever see it, but what makes these moments so interesting to me is that they rely on the player being engaged and curious enough to investigate by themselves, which is why some of the more jump-scary ones never feel like cheap gotcha moments. They require the player to participate, and so they end up feeling like rewards more than punishment the way they do in some games. It might seem strange to reward the player with a scare, but this is a horror game after all. I also like that these moments encourage the player to use the first-person view outside of combat, because with our vision reduced so significantly in first person, it's without a doubt the most vulnerable position we can be in, and these scares often take full advantage of that. My absolute favorite part of Fatal Frame 2's atmosphere, though, is Mayu. If the original Fatal Frame is the quintessential Japanese ghost story, then Fatal Frame 2 draws on many of the best Japanese horror films, cultivating a sense of creeping dread and uncertainty, which they absolutely nail with Mayu. Mayu has a rough time in the village to say the least. Like the siblings in the first game, the twins share a psychic power. Mayu's, however, is stronger, which makes her more susceptible to the spirits in the village, resulting in unsolicited spooky visions and frequent full-on possessions at the hands of Sai, one particularly powerful and angry ghost. This is also reflected in combat, as ghosts will often go for Mayu as opposed to your character Mio. As if that weren't enough, to round things off, she can barely keep up with you as she walks with a permanent limp. She's a character that you're supposed to sympathize with and that you're supposed to feel responsible for. At the same time though, she can be absolutely terrifying. Some of the cutscenes are genuinely tense, and even just some of the things she says will have the player in the same boat as Mio, wondering whether Mayu is really Mayu or not. It's a particularly nice touch that Mayu and Sai share the same voice actress. It's reminiscent of the confusing Mary Maria thing going on in Silent Hill 2, and it works remarkably well in a lot of the cutscenes. At the end of Chapter 7, for example, it's hard to say from line to line whether it's Sai or Mayu talking. I also like that, much like with the items now being hidden away, with Mayu around you're encouraged to slow down, as she'll say just heartbreaking things if you run off too fast. And her running narration, saying that it's cold or commenting on puzzles, really adds so much to the atmosphere. It makes the girls seem human anyway, at least compared to Miku, who, except in cutscenes, exhibits a level of stoicism about the situation that Seneca would envy. I just wish there were more of this chit-chat rather than the endless together forever refrain. I think the atmosphere in the first Fatal Frame is brilliant when you slow down and walk. However, there's almost never a real reason to do that. I think what Fatal Frame 2 does best is give the player multiple reasons to just slow down and let everything about the wonderfully spooky atmosphere, from the setting to the sound design, really sink in a way that it simply doesn't get a chance to in the first game. Either appealing to your completionist nature with the items being hidden away, or preying on your emotions with Mayu. And if you're one of the unfortunate folks who suffer from both like myself, then you're in for quite the spooky time. Fatal Frame 2's fatal flaw, though, for me, is the mechanics. While it maintains the core conceit of taking pictures of ghosts to defeat them, the minutiae of how you go about doing that has seen an almost complete redesign. The main aspect is that the spirit energy from the first game that you had to charge in order to do damage is gone, and replaced with a system that uses proximity to the ghosts to determine damage. The closer you are, the more damage you do. And I do understand the reasoning behind this. The ghosts are scary, and you obviously don't want to get up close to them. And the way the camera automatically zooms in on shutter chances does capture the element of anticipation that's so good in the first game. It's, again, forcing you to face your fears, so to speak. The problem with this is that it simplifies the combat considerably, as it means that you have to be up close to deal any damage at all, and to do any significant damage you have to be using the new combo system. It makes it so that there's a single optimal strategy for every single fight. Chain Fatal Frames. Seriously, you might as well not take the shot if it's not a Fatal Frame because it does almost no damage regardless of what kind of film you're using. The first game wasn't quite so strict. You could still deal considerable damage outside of zero shots, which of course did more damage, but only a bit more. The benefit to getting zero shots was that they earned you more points and pushed ghosts back, which was important because there was a lot more activity going on in the first game's combat as well. You're always doing something, trying to find the ghost, tracking it, charging energy, evading, positioning, none of which is really necessary in Fatal Frame 2. The ghosts are all super slow, very rarely unpredictably teleport, and usually require several shots to take down, so just bait out those Fatal Frames. As you might expect then, this leads to a tremendous amount of waiting. And while waiting is a core part of both games' combat, there are ways to mitigate this in the first game. One of the basic functions on the camera that you could upgrade, and likely the first one you upgraded, was speed, which increased the rate at which the energy charged. Higher tier film reduced the waiting as more characters came pre-charged, and you could also speed things up by simply getting closer to the ghosts, as the energy charged much quicker the closer you were. There was an element of risk versus reward to the combat in the first game, which is completely absent in the second because it's necessary to get close to the ghosts. All of this makes the combat in Fatal Frame 2 feel like it takes forever. Although the average ghost encounter lasts a solid 2 to 3 minutes in both games, in Fatal Frame 2 you feel every second of it, because there's simply far less to do. Again, just bait out those Fatal Frames. This creates problems for the horror element of the combat as well. The animation that shocks you the first time you see it very quickly becomes predictable, mundane, and tedious, which kills any sense of horror, and it led to me rarely anticipating anything the way I was in the first game, only when something unpredictable happened, which wasn't very often.
Ghosts aren't so bad once you figure out the trick behind them.
The simplicity of the combat is my main problem with the mechanics, but there's also a laundry list of other smaller but no less frustrating annoyances. The lack of a quick turn in the original PS2 release. The fact that it's not circle to back out of menus like it is in the first game, but triangle. And you'll be in the menus pretty often, because while there is a way to switch lenses in the viewfinder mode, which is more or less unnecessary because you never need to use anything other than the blast lens, which is objectively the best one, there's no way to switch film in the viewfinder mode, which is something you'll need to do quite a lot, especially if you're frugal with your film the way I am. The upgrade system remarkably makes even less sense contextually than it does in the first game. In the original game, the camera was at least in the Hinasaki family. It belonged to Mafuyu, of course, but Miku had almost certainly seen the camera before and was probably vaguely familiar with how to use it. But in Fatal Frame 2, there's nothing like that. Mio just finds it on the ground and minutes later is upgrading it. How does she know how to do that? Although I do think they try to contextualize how the upgrade system actually works, with the spirit orbs now upgrading the basic functions and lenses. Again, I think you have to add the orbs to the camera in some way, shape, or form, and then channel the energy into the orbs. It's not contextualized very well, and it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's better than nothing, I guess, so okay. In a similar contextual vein, it's also worth mentioning that in Fatal Frame 2, higher tier films simply do more damage, which is actually kind of strange, and also why I like the first Fatal Frame's charge system from a contextual point of view as well. Although the description in the first game says that higher tier film has more power, it doesn't really matter what kind of film you're using because all film has the potential to do the same amount of damage. It's more about the camera's charge, which I'm pretty sure is the thing that's supposed to be special here, not what brand of exorcismal film you're using, which is just completely bizarre. Where does that even come from? Do you just pop on over to the B&H and pick up some exorcismal film? I would like to see it so that the type of film you have equipped affects only the speed of things. Higher tier films should charge faster and reload faster. Film speed, after all, although it doesn't work anything like this in reality, is an actual thing. All that said, however, it does have some really great moments. I like that Fatal Frame 2 sees the player facing multiple ghosts at once much more often than in the first game, and some of these fights can be quite challenging. One boss, for example, you seem to fight in nothing but cramped, narrow hallways, which is quite difficult, and this godforsaken room is the Ornstein and Smo of Fatal Frame. But Chapter 7 is what I hope people recall when they say that Fatal Frame 2 is the best in the series, because it is a great chapter from start to finish. It starts with you having lost your only means of defense and having to run from ghosts until you can get the camera back. There were running scenes like this in the first game too, but here it's handled much better because ghosts will actually engage you. Look at me here go for the camera only to realize I don't have it and then just bail into the room on my right. The second great part of Chapter 7 is kiting Sai around what's effectively a maze, and while it is a shame that you never have to hide from the ghost on your own, it's all handled in cutscenes, you do have to avoid her, and she is tenacious to say the least. The puzzle you have to solve here is also pretty great, because it's probably the only time you'll have to back out of the puzzle to check your file for a solution you got probably half an hour ago, translate it, and enter it, all while a very angry ghost is chasing you down. It's a pretty tense moment. The boss of Chapter 7 is Chitose, which is hands down my favorite fight in the game. While she does have a pattern of attacks, it's not one like virtually every other ghost in the game where you can just bait, retreat, beat, repeat. Many of the times you'll see her, she just cries, and while you can shoot her during these animations, it's again not worth it for such little damage. It feels like you're very much fighting on her terms rather than you controlling the fight. She also has a special move where she shouts and makes the screen go black, which causes some moments of genuine panic and made me relive some of the anticipation I felt in the first game. And who can forget the cutscene at the end of Chapter 7? But that's getting into the narrative, so suffice it to say that while it certainly has its moments, the mechanics in Fatal Frame 2 leave a lot to be desired. And it seems like Project Zero realized this as well, as they went back to a charge system in every game after the second one, and even in the Wii remake of Crimson Butterfly. Fatal Frame 2 follows Mio and Mayu Amakura, twin sisters who are visiting a childhood play place that will soon be flooded to accommodate a dam when Mayu follows a curious crimson butterfly into the woods. Mio follows, and the two are spirited away to the lost All Gods village, a village that shouldered the responsibility of performing the Crimson Sacrifice ritual, which was believed to unite the souls of a pair of twins and turn it into a deity by having the older strangle the younger. The creation of the deity, as well as the spiritual energy released during this ritual, was enough to satiate the hellish abyss located beneath the village and prevent the repentance from occurring for approximately 10 years. Much like the first game, by the time Mio and Mayu arrive, the worst has already happened. The failure of 2 subsequent rituals caused the Hellgate to open, which cursed the village, engulfing it in darkness, killing most of the villagers, and corrupting the spirits of Sai Kurosawa, the last sacrificed twin, as well as Seijiro Makabe, an outsider who was tortured and made into an additional sacrifice known as a kusabi, who then proceeded to kill any remaining survivors in the village. Now the cursed spirits relive the events of that night over and over, searching for a way to change their circumstances, and our unfortunate heroes bear a striking resemblance to the twins chosen for the last ritual. Again, much like the first game, the story is told through cutscenes, books, which are often on bookshelves where they belong, which I appreciate, notes, and stones rather than tapes this time, which I'm not sure how I feel about. They both make sense in their own ways. People exploring a location in the 80s to gather research for a novel would probably have recorded things. That doesn't explain why the tapes are scattered around the mansion and not all together, but nevertheless. The stone radio makes sense in that it's developed by the same guy who made the camera obscura. It seems reasonable that he would also make a radio, and also that an object kept on a person for an extended period of time would absorb the person's thoughts and emotions. I can buy that. However, as far as a storytelling device goes, the stone radio is by far the most useless thing in the series. Most of the stones tell you absolutely nothing you didn't already know. The first one we pick up, for example, tells us that Miyako loves her boyfriend, which is already pretty clear from the notes and her finding her way into this village to look for him. For Woman in Box here, we learn that it was dark. From this woman, we learn that a broken neck hurts. With the tapes, there's at least build-up. It's admittedly pretty cliched build-up, but it has a purpose in the story. The vast majority of these stones are just a waste of time. More importantly, however, the narrative suffers from some pretty serious pacing issues. Chapters 5, 6, and parts of 7 are almost entirely filler. Chapter 5 sees us visit a location we've already explored, fight ghosts we've already fought, and learn nothing new unless we opt for the fairly lengthy side quest that's introduced, while you're supposed to be getting a key to get your sister out of a cell. Chapter 6 takes place in the Kiryu house, which is quite possibly the worst part of the game. The only pressing story-related issue is trying to follow your sister into the Tachibana house, which involves going through the Kiryu house across the way, solving an extremely long, tedious puzzle in which we have to hunt all over the house for parts of a doll needed to activate a mechanism that opens the underground passageway that connects the two houses, enter the Tachibana house, and then backtrack through the Kiryu house to pick up the camera we dropped at the end of the chapter.
Kill me.
You said it, girl. Over the course of Chapter 6, we do learn what happens to the remaining of the ritual, which is good, even if I do think it could have been more efficiently done by simply telling Itsuki's story, a character we already know and care about rather than introduce 3 new characters for that sole purpose, and explore a house that's largely a copy of the one across the way, which, while there is a reason for it being so similar in the game, is nevertheless pretty tedious. The entire Kiryu story thread could be cut, and we'd only miss out on some creepy dolls and an admittedly pretty good boss fight. These 3 chapters in particular, but largely the last half of the game, chapters 5 through 8, feel like padding. There's very little momentum through these chapters. There are no reveals or anything important or engaging to really keep you going through them. Everything important happens in the last chapter. Compare this to the first game, in which the first real boss is Takamine, the guy Miku's brother originally came to Himuro Mansion to find. We get closure for his and his staff's story, and the game then moves on to another facet of the story. On night 2, we learn about the blinding mask, meet that ghost, and learn her story. The original Fatal Frame is much more tightly structured than the second. Every night tells its own story, and these stories have peaks and valleys. The chapters in Fatal Frame 2 usually don't. Chapter 7, for example, is titled Sai, but you'll spend considerably more time learning about and fighting Chitose than you will dealing with Sai. And if anyone can tell me what Chapter 5 is actually about, then maybe you ought to be doing this. Speaking of Sai, there's also the issue of the antagonist. Both Sai and the Kusabi appear briefly in the 3rd chapter, but rather than Sai, it's the Kusabi who's built up as a menacing figure in almost the exact same way that Kyrie is in the first game, right down to the grainy black and white film effect during a run from him or he'll one-shot you scene. But after this single room, he isn't seen or even mentioned again until the final boss in Chapter 9. It means that for the majority of the game, there is no real antagonist. There is Sai, of course, but with the exception of Chapter 7, she only ever appears in cutscenes and she's generally not targeting you, she's targeting Mayu, which you can't really do anything about. That, and you don't even fight her on the difficulty that you're most likely to play the first time through, and that gives you the canonical ending to the game. It leaves you, as Mio, feeling removed from any real threat in the game. That's not to say there aren't stakes, but the threat inherent in Mayu being possessed by Sai isn't explored nearly enough. Again, only in Chapter 7, which again is great with her calling out to you during the maze part, but it's only in this chapter, not an ongoing menace like it is in the first game. That said, however, as is the case with the atmosphere and the mechanics, the parts of the narrative that are good are really, really good. The end of Chapter 4 actually tugged at the heartstrings a bit, which was wholly unexpected. There's the underlying themes of blame and guilt, established in the opening cutscene with Mio very clearly blaming herself for inadvertently hurting Mayu and never really getting over it, which is further explored in the village, as almost every character either blames themselves or someone else for something or other. And of course the canonical ending to the game, which sees the spirits of the village actually succeed and carry out the ritual using Mio and Mayu, which, unsurprisingly, ends in tragedy. It's rare in horror games especially that the haunting is understood but ultimately can't be beaten. That's actually pretty scary. However, the ending could have been more effective and more quintessentially Japanese if the translation were a bit more faithful. There's a pretty significant twist that's unfortunately lost in translation in the North American version at the very least, as they never mention which sister is older, which is a shame because it's kind of a big deal. The Crimson Sacrifice ritual isn't just one sister kills the other, but that the older kills the younger. In the North American version, you'd be forgiven for thinking, as I did the first time I played, that with how resourceful, responsible, and protective of her sister she is, that Mio is the elder. And so the ending, while certainly shocking, you can sort of see coming once you start reading about the ritual. However, Mio is actually the younger sister, which is made very clear in the Japanese, as Mio calls Mayu the familial honorific for an older sister. Knowing that, then, you'd read through the literature on the ritual and realize that Mayu is supposed to kill Mio. You'd say, there's no way, Mayu couldn't hurt Mio, she couldn't hurt a fly. Which not only makes Sai's possession of her all the more terrifying as she's not precious little Mayu anymore, but recontextualizes the alternate ending as well, making a case for why Mio would leave the village on her own. Something I never even considered when I played. Of course I'd go back for my sister. Why wouldn't I? But knowing that the ritual involves the elder killing the younger, and knowing that Mayu is fully under Sai's control at this point, does Mio risk going to the actual location this ritual is performed to try and snap her sister out of it? Japanese horror is all about this last-minute twist. Keisuke Kikuchi himself mentions this in an interview about the game. For me to be able to predict the ending halfway through the game the first time I played it is nothing short of a botch. And while it's a botch on part of the localization team rather than the developers, it's still a real shame. But while the lack of a twist is unfortunate, it doesn't ruin what I think is the absolute best part of Fatal Frame 2. The epilogue. Fade to Mio sitting at the newly built dam alone. We get a brief glimpse of the mark on her neck alluded to earlier in the game, signifying that she's a remaining, and yeah, that actually happened. And then we get a callback, to the very same way the game opens, with Mayu's refrain. Only now, at the end of the game, it carries a much different meaning, reflected by the slightly different wording to that in the opening.
Didn't we always promise each other? Together, forever.
Victims of traumatic experiences don't just forget them, and this transforms Mayu's refrain, which up till now has been a charming, encouraging, comforting, heartwarming expression of sisterly love, into something absolutely chilling. making it so that rather than surviving a horror, the horror comes from being a survivor, which is a genuinely interesting idea that I've never seen explored in the horror genre and certainly not in video games, ultimately making the absolute struggle it can be to get here actually kind of worth it. Fatal Frame 2 isn't my favorite game in the series, but it's definitely something special. If nothing else, it's a sequel done more or less right. It keeps what worked in the first game and improves it dramatically, as is the case with the atmosphere and the unique take on horror, but rather than a consistently solid experience, Fatal Frame 2 achieves higher highs, but also lower lows than the first game, stumbling particularly with the mechanics and the pacing. But Project Zero aren't done yet, and neither am I. Next time we'll be taking a look at Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented. I'll see you then.